A concerning number of small business owners across the country are considering shutting up shop.
I mean, I've worked and lived in the city for 40 years. I've seen different cycles, and this is definitely the worst.
In North Lismore, there's a street where every second house carries a for sale sign, except the ones that have already been walked away from entirely. After the 2022 floods hit, more than 566 people left in a single year, and most of them didn't leave because they wanted to. Their insurance had been cancelled, their buyback application got rejected, and with nothing left to hold them there, they went. What happened in Lismore isn't a disaster story though, and that's the thing worth understanding before anything else. It's a pattern, and right now, at least 4 other Australian cities are running the same numbers at different speeds. Population bleeding out, young people clearing out first, services pulling back behind them, and property values finally catching up to what residents could already feel in their bones. Over the next 18 minutes, we're going through all 5 of them, not to frighten anyone, but because if you own property in any of these places, or you're weighing up a purchase, you need to understand what the data is actually showing, rather than what the real estate brochure has decided to emphasise. Here's the wider picture. According to the ABS, internal migration has fundamentally reshuffled since 2020, with Australians moving between states and cities in patterns the country hasn't seen in decades. But buried inside that headline are the cities receiving nobody, the ones that aren't gaining from the shuffle, but simply losing to it. Australia added roughly 650,000 people last year, and almost all of them landed in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, leaving everywhere else competing for the remainder. Some cities have already stopped competing. What follows is what happens when housing costs, job losses, climate exposure and policy failure arrive at the same address simultaneously. These 5 cities aren't outliers. They're the early signal. Let's start with the one that's been the quietest about its own decline. Adelaide is not a city in visible crisis, and that's precisely what makes it worth watching closely. Clean streets, genuine livability, locals who'll tell you honestly that it's a good place to be, and they're not wrong about any of that. But underneath the surface, ABS data puts Adelaide's population growth at roughly 1.5%, which makes it the second slowest of any Australian capital, and the growth it does record comes almost entirely from overseas migration. Internal migration, meaning Australians actively choosing to move there, runs negative. Locals are leaving faster than other Australians are deciding to arrive. A city being replenished rather than growing is not a city thriving, and the wound underneath that trend never fully healed after Holden. When the Elizabeth plant shut in 2017, 950 direct jobs disappeared on the day of the announcement, and supply chain analysis at the time estimated more than 6,000 jobs across the broader economy followed them out. Elizabeth, Salisbury, the northern suburbs, these were communities built around that industry across generations, and what they received in return was retraining programs and patience they hadn't asked for. Picture this. You're a 52-year-old tradesman in Elizabeth who spent 2 decades working either at Holden or servicing the people who did. The plant closes, you retrain, and the new job pays $18,000 less per year than what you had. Your mortgage doesn't adjust for that. Your grocery bill certainly doesn't. South Australian government data puts nearly 1 in 5 households in the state under financial stress right now, and that figure isn't describing an abstraction. That's your neighbour. The state government points to defence industry investment and a technology sector as the engine that gets them to 670,000 new residents by 2050, which would require 315,000 new homes and 254,000 new jobs. None of that is necessarily wrong as a long-term projection. The problem is that those jobs exist on timelines measured in years, and the people leaving are leaving today. Adelaide's decline doesn't announce itself. Street by street in the outer suburbs, it drifts. Though, and cities that drift long enough without interruption don't always find their way back. What Adelaide shows us is what slow, undramatic decline looks like when no single moment forces anyone to pay attention. But the next city shows what happens when a single industry doesn't just leave a place, it inflates the market on the way out and then takes the air with it. Darwin carries a problem that no city wants to say out loud. Most of the people living there have already decided, at least privately, that they won't be staying. The population sits around 150,000, but research from Charles Darwin University found that roughly 2 in 3 Darwin residents describe themselves as temporary residents. They're there for work, for a contract, for the income, and then they leave. The ABS has recorded 32 consecutive quarters of negative internal migration, which adds up to 8 straight years of more Australians leaving Darwin than arriving to replace them. 1 in 5 residents turns over every single calendar year. That's not a city sustaining itself. That's a work site with suburbs attached, and the housing market spells out exactly when that sentiment converted into movement. During the LNG construction boom from 2010 to 2014, Darwin's median house price climbed to $650,000, driven upward by engineers, project managers, and contractors who needed somewhere to live and earned enough to push the market wherever they walked. Then the construction phase ended, the workers left, and the median fell roughly $150,000 to $200,000 in the years that followed. It was settling somewhere between $450,000 and $500,000, depending on the quarter. Palmerston in 2013 would have looked like a reasonable decision to a contractor 2 years into a decent contract, with the city appearing to boom around them. By 2018, a buyer from that peak was staring at a valuation $180,000 below what they'd paid. Caught between a loss they couldn't afford to crystallise by selling and a mortgage they couldn't exit without selling. Staying costs more than leaving, but leaving costs more than staying, and that trap has held people in Darwin for years, past the point they'd planned to go. The deeper failure isn't the housing market falling though. Darwin has never managed the transition from resource economy to resident economy, and without that transition, people pass through rather than putting down roots. And without roots, there's no political pressure to fix the things that would make them want to stay. Darwin shows what happens when a city attracts workers but never quite converts them into residents. The next one shows what happens when a city is small enough that losing anyone matters, and it's been losing them quietly for years. Launceston is the largest regional city in Tasmania, and last year it recorded the largest population decline of any LGA in the country, shedding 261 people from a base of 71,000. That number sounds manageable until you look at who's leaving. Not retirees heading somewhere warmer. The ones clearing out are 22-year-olds finishing TAFE and doing the maths on what secure full-time work actually looks like in northern Tasmania compared to Melbourne. And that maths doesn't come close. Tasmania's overall population growth runs 8 times below the national average according to ABS figures, and Launceston's decade-long average lands at 0.05% per year, a rate at which you don't grow, you barely hold on, and only if nothing goes wrong. Something is going wrong in the schools. Multiple Launceston schools have lost between 30 and 100 students in just 2 years, and the principals talking about it quietly aren't just describing enrolment numbers. Losing that many students pulls funding with them, then staff, and eventually the school's viability itself. Families watching that happen start asking whether they want their children enrolled somewhere that's visibly contracting around them, and the answer to that question has its own implications for the next round of departures. The number one reason people give for leaving Launceston isn't lifestyle, and it isn't housing costs. It's the absence of secure, well-paid work in a city that has a functioning TAFE, a university campus, and genuine infrastructure, just not enough of the jobs that turn qualifications into careers. If that pattern continues without anything interrupting it, Launceston enters a feedback cycle that's very hard to exit. Fewer young residents means fewer workers. Fewer workers means fewer businesses willing to stay. Fewer businesses means fewer services, and fewer services means fewer reasons for the next family to hold on. The next generation of Launceston is making that decision right now, and most of them are making it in favour of leaving. Launceston is being hollowed out slowly. But the next city got hollowed out by something it thought was a success story, and didn't notice the damage until it was already done. For about 5 years, Hobart was the Australian property story everyone wanted to tell. Prices surging, lifestyle coverage everywhere. The coolest small city in the country, and apparently the proof that regional Australia could finally compete. Between 2016 and 2021, Hobart's median house prices climbed somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000 in nominal terms. And by CoreLogic measures, the city had become one of the least affordable in the country relative to its income base. Median prices in inner Hobart crossed $1 million, not far off Sydney numbers, but sitting on top of Tasmanian wages. The ratio between that median price and the regional median income reached nearly 13 times. That's not a housing market with an affordability challenge. That's a barrier wall built to keep local earners out. Only 10% of Hobart's housing stock is apartments, which means there's almost no affordable entry point remaining, and the people priced out didn't find a cheaper suburb with a longer commute. They left the state. And now the boom has stalled, leaving behind the people who bought at the peak with a problem the optimistic projections didn't prepare them for. Thousands of Hobart buyers locked in fixed rates at 2% and 2.5% during 2020 and 2021, felt smart about the decision at the time and watched those fixed terms expire. Based on RBA rate movement data, many of those buyers now carry mortgage repayments running $500 to $1,000 per month above what they originally budgeted for. A modest house in Moona, bought for $720,000 in late 2021, tells the story clearly enough. Lock in a 2-year fixed rate, feel like you've managed the risk, and then arrive in 2023 to find repayments $850 a month higher than the plan accounted for. Nothing irresponsible about the decision, and nothing unusual about the person who made it. They just believed the rate environment would stay manageable, and it didn't. And now they're choosing between selling into a softening market or absorbing a cost that's eating through their monthly budget. Based on what followed Darwin's boom-driven run-up, analysts have flagged a potential correction of $150,000 to $250,000 on Hobart's most exposed properties in a sustained downside scenario. That's not a certainty. It's a measurable risk with a historical precedent behind it. Hobart shows what happens when a city attracts attention and demand it can't financially sustain for the people who actually live and work there. The next city on this list shows what happens when something arrives that no policy can plan away, and the government response to it makes the damage worse. In February 2022, Lismore recorded the highest floodwaters in its measured history, with the levee designed to protect the city topped by more than 2 metres. 4 people died. Thousands of homes went under, some to the roofline, and in the 12 months that followed, at least 566 residents left. Schools lost hundreds of students. Businesses that had operated for decades shuttered permanently, and many of the people who departed have never returned, because there was nothing adequate waiting for them if they did. What converts this from a natural disaster into a policy failure is the insurance picture. Roughly 2/3 of households on Lismore's floodplain carried no flood insurance at the time of the flooding, not out of carelessness, but because many of them had already been refused coverage by insurers, or had been quoted premiums running $8,000, $12,000, $15,000 per year, figures that make insurance a theoretical right and a practical impossibility for most households. Around 1,200 homes remain financially exposed to the next major flood event, and the government buyback scheme designed to purchase the most at-risk properties covered some of those households, while many fell through the gaps, either sitting above the buyout threshold, receiving unfavourable property value calculations, or simply running out of money while waiting for a process that moved too slowly. And here's the thing that doesn't get said often enough. Lismore was already fragile before a drop of rain fell in 2022. Unemployment sat above the state average. The population skewed older. Rates of disability support recipients ran higher than comparable regional cities. The flood didn't manufacture vulnerability. It hit a place that already had no buffer and took away what remained. What you're watching play out in Lismore now is compounding exit. Once enough people leave, the services follow them out, the GP clinic cuts its hours, the school rolls fall below viable enrolment sizes, the hardware store closes because there aren't enough tradespeople left to sustain it. Oh, and each of those closures becomes one more reason for the next family weighing up whether to stay or go. Lismore isn't recovering on the trajectory it would need to recover on. Communities in Queensland's flood corridors and fire-prone regional Victoria are watching what happened there and quietly running the same numbers on their own situation. 5 cities, different sizes, different states, different causes on the surface, but run the numbers side by side, and 3 forces keep showing up. The first is single event or single industry dependency. Adelaide lost Holden. Darwin lost the construction phase of its LNG boom. Lismore lost a flood season the city was never engineered to survive. When one thing carries too much of a place's economic weight, too many jobs, too much of the housing demand, too much of the protection against risk, on losing it doesn't just hurt the immediate numbers, it restructures everything underneath. The second is wages that never caught the market. Hobart and Adelaide make this visible most clearly. Property prices moved on investor sentiment and interstate demand. Local wages didn't follow, and the people who actually live and work in those cities got priced into a corner they can't exit without selling at a loss or simply leaving. The third is government response that treats the symptom without addressing what's underneath it. Retraining programs instead of replacement industries. Buyback schemes that cover some households and leave others exposed. Infrastructure promises measured in decades while the population bleeds out in years. None of these are random failures arriving independently. Kio, they're the same failure running at different speeds across different postcodes. For anyone who owns property or is weighing a purchase in a regional or mid-sized Australian city, 3 specific things are worth checking before committing to anything. Pull the internal migration data from the ABS, not just the total population growth figure. A city can show growth on paper entirely through overseas arrivals, while locals are quietly leaving in the background. And those 2 trends carry very different implications for your local economy and the services that underpin your property's value. Check the flood and climate risk overlays on your specific address, not the suburb, the address itself. What happened in Lismore isn't a single city risk. According to the Climate Council, several 100,000 Australian properties carry material uninsurable flood or fire exposure, and the insurance market has already started pricing that in. The property market is beginning to follow, and for any city or town where one major employer, one major project, or one dominant industry defined the last decade, find out what actually replaced it, not what the government has announced will replace it, but what exists now with jobs that pay at a rate that services a mortgage. That question used to be optional homework. Based on what Darwin and Holden era Adelaide show us, it no longer is. The question worth sitting with after all of this is one without a clean answer. At what point does a government quietly decide a place is too expensive to genuinely save? Not too expensive to fund a press release about, and not too expensive to announce a program for, but too expensive to fix at the scale that would actually interrupt the decline. Because that decision, if it's being made somewhere in a budget spreadsheet, doesn't get announced. It shows up in the data a few years later. Fewer buybacks than the situation required. Infrastructure timelines that stretch well past the problem they were meant to solve. Retraining budgets that don't match the scale of what was lost in the first place. Lismore may already be getting its answer to that question. Darwin got its answer a decade ago. The others are still waiting on theirs. This situation isn't static. Population data keeps updating, insurance market withdrawals are accelerating, and the mortgage rate reset cycle hasn't finished working through the system. If staying across what's actually happening matters to you, subscribe, because this is one of those stories that keeps moving whether anyone's watching it or not.